Okay, yeah, feel free to ask questions throughout. So my approach to suicidal behavior is different to the typical psychiatric or mental health paradigm. It's rooted in evolutionary medicine, which is a somewhat new field of medicine developed by George C. Williams. He actually wrote the evolutionary biologist who wrote the book on natural selection and adaptation, along with a psychiatrist, Randy Nesse. They wrote a book called Why We Get Sick, published, I think, in 1992. And they identified 7 reasons for why, organisms, evolved organisms get sick. And we'll discuss those in relation to humans. The first one is defenses. That is, symptoms of illness or forms of suffering are in fact adaptations that work by way of being aversive. For instance, vomiting is a way of expelling toxins from the body, diarrhea, coughing, also psychological and phenomena, sadness, as well as the experience of pain. These let us know that there are threats and dangers nearby. And so although they are painful, and they're associated with illness and threats, they're actually functional and adaptive. And actually stopping, preventing the symptom from working can actually prolong illness in some cases. Another one is mismatch. That is that the environments we live in are different than the ones we adapted to. So for instance, we have guns these days that kill us. So for instance, a lot of suicides that result in death probably would not have resulted in death if there were not guns around or if there were not certain types of synthetic drugs around. Also, another example is just how high calorie diets, the fact that humans these days are so, prone to obesity in America more than here. But yeah, I mean, it's because we have these foods that were actually extremely rare when we evolved, but now they are plentiful. And the other ones are trade-offs. These are necessary compromises in the functions of traits. For instance, there is a trade-off between growth and immune function in childhood. We also, of course, have coevolution with pathogens. So COVID-19 keeps evolving. It keeps threatening us. We'll never do anything about infectious disease. They're always going to continually evolve. And there are constraints on what natural selection can do. Adaptations build on what currently exists. So, for example, humans are prone to choking, uh, unlike other animals, because of just the way our larynx happens to be situated on our esophagus. And of course, reproduction can come at the expense of health and survival. We see this obviously in black widows and various types of insects that reproduction doesn't necessarily increase long-term survival, and that can certainly be the case in humans as well. And while some of these, for instance, mismatch and reproduction at the expense of health and survival do have some implications for suicidal behavior, I'm going to focus on suicidal behavior as a type of defense, specifically a defense against exploitation from social partners. And it's actually a special class of symptoms that are called, or a special class of defenses that are called signals. Oops. I seem to. Okay, sorry. It was not in the order I expected it to be. Okay, so yeah, so we've applied this not only to suicidal behavior, but also to other mental health disorders to identify, how can we tell the difference between a psychiatric condition that is truly a dysfunction versus something that may be an adaptation but unpleasant. Hallmarks of dysfunction from an evolutionary perspective include that a trait has high heritability. That is, it has not been removed by purifying selection. It's probably related to a mutation on a small number of alleles, and thus is going to have higher heritability. It's likely to be associated with a developmental stage or transition, such that whatever the underlying switch is associated with that developmental transition, that is probably those suite of genes are where the mutation is located. And it should have low population prevalence. So it's high heritability. It's these rare deleterious mutations. And so that it shouldn't be very common in the population. And that's so here, this figure on the y-axis, we have the heritability of mental disorders on a liability scale. That is, it's a binary, you either have it or you don't. And on the x-axis is the prevalence in the population. And so on the the mental disorders in red, schizophrenia, OCD, bipolar disorder, Tourette's. These tend to be highly heritable, or at least relatively so compared to others, and they tend to be rare in the population. On the other hand, PTSD, major depression, anxiety disorders, these are very common in the population. About 50% of people in the West, in their lifetimes, will be diagnosed with a mental disorder. The vast majority of those are going to be major depression, anxiety, or PTSD. They have so they have lower heritability. They're common in the population. Onset is associated with adolescence and adulthood, but you can get it when you're a teenager, or you can develop it later in life. It is also reliably associated with fitness threats. So depression is associated with specifically loss or not achieving one's goals, but specifically more specifically in the context of conflicts. Similarly, PTSD and anxiety disorders are threat responses. Okay, so this is the one I thought we were going to first. So symptoms as signals. So what my colleagues and I have proposed is that some of the symptoms of mental disorders may be functional in terms of avoiding the threat, but some of them are specifically functional in getting help or signaling to others that one is in true need of help and not in a state when they're lying about their need. So signaling theory, the bargaining model does frame suicidal behavior as a costly signal of need. Signaling theory explains communication dynamics between organisms and how honest signals can evolve and become evolutionarily stable despite the risk of deception. Signals are specifically traits of organisms that have evolved specifically to communicate to others. This is different from, say, cues, which we can just recognize, okay, someone is vomiting, okay, they're sick, but that doesn't mean that vomiting evolved to tell others that someone is sick. What would we expect is that there's specifically some social component, and that, in fact, with many illness symptoms, we do see social components in distress signals. So first of all, distress signals, we have pain expressions as we find across the tree of life, vocalizations when we're in pain or afraid, lethargy, social withdrawal. These are observed across species and across populations when people are facing threats. We also know that there's quite a bit of research that these distress signals can be context dependent. So if people aren't around, people don't display those signals to the same degree than if other people are around. So for instance, there's been reports that patients report higher pain and distress when actually loved ones are present than when they're not present, or if just an authority figure is present. So it's context dependent. Are the people who care about your well-being, are they around? It's also been proposed that the placebo effect might work the way it does precisely because it's an interpersonal healing function. So you feel that the pain, maybe you have this added level of pain that is resolved when you receive the interpersonal help. That's still the case. That doesn't mean that the underlying issue is resolved, but at least the interpersonal healing aspect has been resolved, which is very important in our species. We have relied on healthcare and assistance. We see this, going back to Neanderthals. So the adaptive functions of common mental health symptoms. So first of all, PTSD has been linked to hypervigilance, startle, and nightmares. And this is considered to be an adaptive learning and preparation mechanism, and likely is mismatched to the modern environment where people are much safer and during the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness or during human evolution, if you experience a threat once, you'd probably experience that threat again. Nowadays, people go to war in other countries and they come back to safer places and they have lifelong symptoms from that. Another one, depression, social withdrawal, low mood, anhedonia, somatization. My PhD advisor, Ed Hagen, and I, along with other colleagues, have been exploring this for about 10 years. So there's quite a bit of evidence that depression is in fact a response to conflict. So for example, we know that the loss of a loved one is a risk factor, but is an even higher risk factor. What mediates that is conflict. So if you lose a loved one, but maybe you're able to replace that, you're able to get the help you need, you're able to replace at least some of the services or the value that that person brought to your life. But if you're not able to receive those benefits from others, that's a greater risk factor for prolonged sadness. And I would say it's probably likely causal. We also know across societies that depression, people have looked at depression symptoms in different societies. It's not called depression, and it might be called soul loss, or it might be called spirit possession. It is also medicalized in many societies. And treatments in these contexts often actually include explicit conflict resolution. So for instance, in one society, if a woman feels, if a young woman is depressed, this is sort of the standard case, her elders will pay for a ceremony by the shaman, the healer. And basically what is told here is a story about a young woman who might be some myth about a young woman who was spurned by her uncles, who are also the people paying for the ceremony. And so these stories will be told and sort of made to make it okay. But at the end of the day, they maintain the social structure. So the person gets some consolation. They might get they get to be the center of attention. Their grievances are aired, and they might get some special gifts. This is what we see across many societies. And then in the case of self-harm and suicidality, we framed it as a signal of need and severe conflict and powerlessness. It reflects an escalation of conflict. And it's important to note that although suicide is a manner of death, most suicidal behavior is non-fatal, the vast majority. And this was likely true even more so over evolutionary history. And so yes, we found, and I'll share some of this in a moment, looking at ethnographic data, that severe conflicts and powerlessness precedes suicidal behavior across diverse societies. We've also found, I did field work with a Pacific Islander population that has high rates of suicide. And what I found is that in fact taking risks on oneself is a way that young people use to resolve conflict in the family. And I'll share some of those, an example of that. So this figure here, this is CDC data from 2001 to 2019. And this is just to show you just how more prevalent non-fatal suicidal behavior is. So these are hospitalizations for self-harm on the y-axis, by age on the x-axis. And these dotted lines down here, these are suicide deaths, red being males and purple being females. So for young women aged 20, there are 500 to 1 suicide attempts to suicides. For males age 25, it's 250 to 1. So, and actually you might note that, we'll talk about this in a moment, women seem to be most at risk at the prime of their reproduction. We'll talk about why that might be, actually, because of sexual abuse. So violence, sexual abuse, and bullying are predictors of suicidality. This is found cross-nationally. And the fact that people do survive thus means that suicide attempters stand a chance of seeing improved outcomes, that is, stopping the harm or stopping the abuse. This is the causes of suicidal behavior from a database called the Human Relations Area Files. It's a database of world culture. This came specifically from the probability sample files of 60 cultures. And I coded basically the cause of suicidal behavior inductively. And what we have here is on the x-axis, this is the proportion of a cause that was associated with females. So for instance, forced marriage was exclusively associated with females. And on the x-axis, it's the proportion of a cause that was associated with males. So for instance, failing others, betrayal, drunkenness, these were all in this data exclusively associated with men. And then conflict, you might notice in the middle, because these were nested variables. Conflict is associated with both men and women pretty equally. And this is interesting because it actually reflects the reproductive constraints of males and females, that men across societies are limited, their fitness is limited by status. So lower status men have much lower reproduction than higher status men, whereas it's much more equal for women across. However, females, of course, are more choosy, and they are more harmed by forced copulation, by rape. And I would include forced marriage also being a type of rape. Yeah, so this is actually exactly what an evolutionary perspective would predict. And it seems to be strategic, that humans are strategically signaling in situations that are more dire to them. And also what we found in this data, although this is ethnographic data, so not everyone who was talking about suicide, they didn't get all the details necessarily. But when they did have information about what happened if the person survived, 75% of the time, it was that they had a improved outcome. There was a forced marriage was stopped, a person was forgiven, something along these lines. So we call this the bargaining model. Obviously, there are many more strategies for bargaining beyond suicide, of course, hopefully. Bargaining is a process of coordination where two or more parties reach an agreement on a social contract. So that could be, the division of benefits, the division of labor, marriage arrangements. And bargaining power is the ability to exert control over others by imposing cost or withholding benefits at a lower cost to the self, at a lower cost than what your opponent is able to exert. However, in humans, we are far more mutually dependent on each other than in chimpanzees. So humans have, hundreds of cooperation partners across the life course. Chimpanzees have 10 to 20 same-sex cooperation partners. And this is actually something that can be used as leverage, as in a labor strike. So if you're being harmed by your social partner, they're exploiting you, but you are clearly of value to them, alive and not dead. Then you can attempt to withhold the benefits that they are receiving from you. This means, however, that the lower power person has to pay costs to the self, and this is exactly what we see in labor strikes. And this works precisely because you wouldn't pay the cost unless the harm was real, unless the exploitation was real. You were truly not benefiting from this arrangement. So this is sort of a working predictive model of bargaining strategies. So if you're a high power person, you're in a low threat situation, you can just give verbal commands. If you're a high power person, but you're a high threat situation, this is where we see, homicide, assault, and threats of violence. However, if you're low power, that's quite different. So if there's a low threat, you can use something like gossip or avoidance to manage a conflict. But if it's a high threat, you may have to start imposing costs on yourself in order to impose costs on others. So this would include social withdrawal, depression, also what we call panic hysteria or spirit possession, which we see across many different societies, self-harm, and suicidal behavior. And suicidal behavior in this sense is strategic, though not necessarily conscious per se. Someone's not necessarily saying to themselves, I'm going to attempt suicide to get this or that or to stop something. It doesn't make any claims about that. So we'll take a look. I'll go through these 5 different accounts. I chose these because I think they really illustrate how I picked 2 accounts from the Pacific and 2 accounts from the Middle East and 1 account from Europe. And they really show how the threads, these dimensions of conflict and powerlessness run throughout cases of suicide around the world. It's also interesting because, sometimes you may look at a suicidal behavior and you think, okay, that's actually maybe justified. I can see that. whereas you look at others and you say, oh no, that person's, crazy or something. So we'll take a look at a couple accounts. Um, mm. So it, there are different definitions. So I frame suicidal behavior as continuous. So there are some, with just other self-harm, and it's not necessarily a line in the sand where you can say, this is self-harm and this is suicide. It's often a gray area. But suicidal behavior is basically taking a risk that is a gesture of taking one's life. But it is continuous with self-harm.
For instance, drinking 24 beers in the evening be suicidal behavior?
I think it could be. I mean, I think it's if you. There are certainly people who are drug users. They see their behavior as a prolonged suicide. Yeah, yeah. And standard, yeah, but I actually think from the evolutionary perspective, I think all of these things are interrelated, and I don't think they're as different. Yes, exactly. And maybe we call it suicide, maybe we call it spirit possession, or maybe we call it something else.
Could be actually eating something that they would learn that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean,
they don't have guns, right?
They don't have guns. Yeah. So as far as I know, no one's observed. So primates do actually engage in self-harm when they're under stress. Or like, when they're contained. But yeah, it would have to. There are many reasons why we haven't yet identified a suicide in other animals. Yeah, they engage in self-harm, for sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've seen that actually. People who they know they need to stop eating. They know, I guess it's an addiction, but there's also this like element of like not willing to stop either. Yeah. Yeah, good question. So yeah, I'll give another example in a moment. It's of not something that's not quite suicidal. Anyway, I'll try to go through these quickly, but this is an anthropological account from Afghanistan. This account is two sisters attempted suicide in protest against parental and societal restrictions. Both were engaged in, one was engaged in sports, one was doing musical performance. The parents feared the girls' activities would harm the reputation of the family, affecting the ability of the father to maintain a job. After swallowing a cocktail of tablets, one of the sisters stated, our parents have to understand that we are not bad girls or bad Muslims. If they cannot get this, then there is no point for me to live either. This is a case, it comes from Tikopia. It's actually from a song. Tikopia is a Pacific Islander culture. This is a song composed by a man for his sister who died by suicide. The woman fought with her mother and then died by suicide in the usual method in their culture, which is swimming out to sea. And Firth says this song is a simple statement of fact, yet implicit in its affection, sympathy, and regret. My sister, my nourisher, you have leapt into the ocean, and you did not turn your head to the shore. You formed your idea, your foolish thought, you went away, that you might die. And one thing I want to highlight here is with the mutual dependence that the brother refers to her as his nourisher. So it was a great loss to him in a material sense. So here's a case I'm shocked is not more well known because it's very interesting. This British debutante, Unity Mitford, she was a close friend / lover of Hitler. She stalked Hitler until until they picked up a conversation. So she went to Germany, in the late 30s to find Hitler and befriend him. Her sisters said of her, she told me that if there was a war, that she would kill herself because she couldn't bear to live and see these two countries tearing each other to pieces, both of which she loved. On September 3rd, 1939, Unity visited a Nazi Party official to ask if she would be detained as an enemy alien, and she was told she would not. The party official was concerned by her behavior and had two men follow her, but she got away. She went to the English Garden in Munich, and with a pearl-handled pistol. She shot herself. The pistol was in fact gifted to her from Hitler for protection. She survived the attempt and was hospitalized. And Hitler frequently visited her and paid for her way back. And oh, so nice. Anyway. Yeah, so interesting. It's a very fascinating case. And then here's this is a Hamas suicide terrorist, Nabil Masood. I got this case from Scott Atran 2010. Is described as a kind and gentle 18-year-old boy who changed after the death of his two favorite cousins who were Hamas fighters. He sought meaning in their deaths through suicide terrorism. On March 14th, 2004, he and a friend went to a port to blow themselves up. 11 people were killed, but it was intended to be much worse. Unfortunately, it wasn't. His father, when asked if his son's sacrifice will make life better for Palestinians, his father said, "No, this hasn't brought us even one step forward." However, the boys in the neighborhood who were outside playing soccer, they're saying his courage will make us free. They're celebrating his death. And Atran writes, Nabil was for one flaming moment the hero every boy here wanted to be. And so you can see a bit of the status-seeking element as well as the protest element. And this was a case that I actually collected from Micronesian population, that's a Pacific Islander population. And this case reads, Kaylin's parents were concerned that because she had a new boyfriend, she would end up pregnant before graduating from high school. She was 16 years old. When Kaylin did not return home one night, her mother discovered that she was with her boyfriend and started texting her to come home immediately. Afraid of a confrontation, Kaylin ran away for several days. Because Micronesian parents interpret running away from home as a suicide threat, her parents, fearing the worst, called the police immediately. And of course, when people when they run away, they know that they're making a suicide threat because it's very salient to them. When Kaylin returned home, she found her extended family gathered there. She was forced to apologize to each of her family, and she was scolded. However, she was allowed to continue to see her boyfriend. And when I asked her a couple weeks later, how would you put the situation in your own words? She said, they let me do what I want. So it worked out. She got her boyfriend. Maybe they're still together. I don't know. Yes, so we're getting to the end. So yeah, the bargaining model. So the key predictions are that high severity conflicts, suicidal behavior is predicted by high severity conflicts that impact health, status, and or reproduction, not trivial conflicts. Suicidal individuals are relatively powerless. That is that their problems, whatever it is, they are not believed, they are trivialized, they are not taken seriously or seen as legitimate. The social antagonists and suicidal person have some shared stake. So in fact, most of the time, the people they're in conflict with are their parents or their spouse, and less often is it the government. Although when it is the government, it tends to be very a much more public suicide. More often than not, individuals see improved outcomes following suicide gestures, stopping marriage or thwarting abuse. And the take home is that suicidal behavior is a last resort to signal need. And I had a few more slides, but we are at the end, so we can just stop there.
Yeah, maybe we can do this. Thank you so much, Kristen. We will now open for discussion, and maybe you can use some of your extra slides while the questions arrive. So I will look around. We have Josh and then Lee.
So as you were talking, I was struggling to make sense of how this would make sense of phenomena like mass shootings, which some have claimed are just elaborate forms of public suicide. If only for the fact that, at least in America, when somebody does this, usually they're operating under the assumption that they're not making it out of this alive, because they're going to be killed by the police or somebody else. So very obviously, they're not looking towards the future.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I 100% see mass shooters that way. They are, and when you ask when people have that data, they are suicidal. So yeah, mass shooters are terrorists are suicidal individuals, and they have grievances, and that this is also well known. We see this also. There are examples of this in other cultures. Like we use the term running amok. This is in fact something that does occur in Southeast Asia in very small scale communities, like much smaller than ours. And people, I also see this where I have worked. Someone just gets very angry. They say they're in like a state or a possessed state, and they, beyond even the person that they're mad at per se, they start being violent towards everybody. And that's called running amok. And so, yeah, they have a certain word for it, but I've also seen this like in Micronesia where I've worked, they don't have like a special word for it, but they have a similar phenomenon. And I think, yeah, we know mass shooters are like low status males who want, have a grievance that society has failed them in some way. We know about the case of the incel, the self-identified incel in Santa Barbara, for instance. So it's certainly, yeah, it seems to have the self and other directed violence, plus the level of spectacle for status. Yeah. Yeah, so I would say, so modern, so like mass shooters, oh yeah, so shooting, so this is a far more violent activity than, the running amok, for instance, where people may not even die. So people might be targeted for violence, but they don't necessarily die. So I think it's it's dominance. It's an act of dominance. Yes.
And I'm curious if you could elaborate more.
Yeah. So in many different societies, so for instance, also, so in the Darfur, who I mentioned, in Somalia, in Middle East, there's these czar cult practices. And really we see this throughout the world. In Buddhist traditions, they might call it solos. And also in Chuk, where I work as well. So women use spirit possession to, resolve conflict in the family. So a young woman might show lethargy. She might become sick. She's withdrawing. Alternatively, she might start taking off her clothes and start saying foul language in front of her like family in a really, which is not something you're supposed to do. She is considered completely out of her mind. They genuinely believe in spirit possession. So she's fully possessed and not held accountable for anything she does. Yes. Yes. Yeah. And actually the person in where I work, it's like a grandmother. So it's like suddenly a person, like a young woman, adolescent girl who doesn't have much power in the society. Well, she's breaking the rules somehow. Either she's not cooperating, like she's sick, or she's breaking the rules, taking off her clothes, and then like taking on the voice of like an authority figure who's passed away. And so people, yeah, it's actually a way women resolve conflict without usurping the power of their parents. Yeah.
Now we have Gustavo, then.
So I was thinking that then so there's the suicidal behavior that leads up to supposedly eventually committing suicide.
Well, not necessarily. If the conflict goes unresolved, and so this is something that actually is a predictor of future suicide attempts, is ongoing hostility in relationships. So if it's not resolved the first time, it's not resolved the second time, then we predict to see escalation. Yeah.
But so yeah, that's like that suicidal behavior has a greater components of signaling. While the act itself of committing suicide doesn't necessarily have a lot of signaling associated to it. For example, let's say that you have been harboring feelings about your life in general for very long, but you never talk to anyone about it. You don't seek therapy. You don't have any social or emotional support, and you don't show vulnerability to anyone. And then one day you just do it in a very silent way, for example, with carbon monoxide at home. No one sees you inside of a very comfortable garage and car and so on. In this case, the signaling aspect of it is gone in a way.
Not necessarily.
No.
And this is a really interesting point. So over human evolution, we lived in these really tight-knit, small-scale communities. Nobody had a private room. So, and this is what I see also in Micronesia. So if you're withdrawn, everybody knows you're withdrawn because they don't see you. Like right in this like, you know, a village just the size of a block or something. Yeah, like so if you're even like in Micronesia, if you're even like slightly off or you're missing for a little while, like people get worried. And actually there are cases where someone, you know, like a person goes to hang themselves, they happen to fail, they're alone, but there's always somebody nearby in these places, and somebody does find them, because, you know, they failed. There's always that element. It actually increases, the more private it is, the more it actually increases the honesty of the signal. Yeah.
So, sorry, just quick follow-up. That you just made me think of how many animals, when they're about to die, they recognize this and they will move away from their group to die alone. There could be all sorts of evolutionary reasons, but it almost sounds like they recognize death and somehow they want to remove that out of the group. But in your case, it's the removal of the person out of the group is the message itself as well.
Yeah. So it's that, you know, because these suicides are often young, healthy people. There are those examples of assisted suicides in the Arctic and stuff, but the far more common is the young and healthy people who their parents want to marry them off and have grandchildren. They're providing resources to the community. So yeah, the loss of that person is not something that anybody would actually want.
Acts of suicides, but I wonder how they actually fit in their Parkiani model, where you need like this type of antagonism sometimes, or like this other part that has some stake, right? One is the collective suicide. Collective suicides were very often, you know, the person, one of the people, like, so the people that are embedded in this collective action, like their societies are basically that group that is leaving. So, what's the other side? What's the antagonism? If these people that are embedded in these groups are, like just experiencing this together. And then the other type of suicide is abrupt, impulsive suicides. I mean, we know there are these suicides of people who are just like have this prompt kind of like behavior, right? Semi irrational, or maybe less rational than others. So how does this type of suicide relates to this model in some way also?
Yeah. So yeah, for the impulsive suicides, because sometimes something like there are ethnographic accounts where somebody did some act, like they thought they killed someone, and so they're suddenly very suicidal and attempt suicide. So that's, I think, I would link the impulsive, whether it's impulsive or chronic, it depends on the nature of the situation. And then I'm sorry, what the first question? Collective. Yeah. So yeah, cults. After the Nazis, after the war, so people who are really, they have a strong solidarity with a group, and their group fails or their group is under threat. Yeah, we see the suicidal behavior. And it's fascinating. I don't think it's definitely not the most common kind. It's more unusual, but it is associated with people. I also see I see it in a number of different ways. I can give the example of a hunger strike because I think it illustrates what I think is going on. So when you have a hunger strike, you can signal to your other group members, your in-group members, like, I think we're being mistreated. I want a hunger strike, join me. And then, so they can signal to the other people who are in their situation. They're also, of course, signaling to the prison, if it's a prison situation, to the guards. And so there are two different parties. I think that is also something going on with, self-harming cults, that they are signaling in-group solidarity, commitment, as well as out-group antagonism and distance.
Thank you. Very interesting, and I learned a lot about the politics of suicide. I have a question about you mentioned, or you discussed PTSD and depression and then suicide. And maybe you mentioned this and I missed it, but to what extent are they causally related? So to what extent does PTSD often lead to depression, and that then again leads to suicide? That's the first question. And the second one is related. Because I could imagine that this is different for different types of suicide. So for instance, where the strategy or the goal is more like voice, you haven't used these terms, but this is just my interpretation for voice, for a strategic voice, that there it is less important. But if the goal is exit, right? If it's more exit is more important than voice, make it plain, that then these elements or these these predictions are more important, like depression and or PTSD. So to what extent does it work like that?
Yeah. So first of all, I don't. I mean, they often are comorbid with each other, but I don't know if if someone is experiencing PTSD, I would expect that the depression would be related to, not receiving help or experiencing conflict related to the PTSD. Actually, people who have studied PTSD in warrior populations in Africa have found that, PTSD is associated with threats, and depression among warriors is associated with status loss. So it would be how they interact. And I'm sorry, what's the other one real quick?
Yeah, about different types of suicide and to what extent they are important. So for some, if voice is really important, that's the most important question again. Then I could assume that depression is less of a predictor than when exit is the goal.
Yeah.
It's of course a combination always, right, of both, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard to know. So actually suicide death compared to suicide is really worse. So which ones are the real, it's a question. Which one is the real suicide, if there are any? I think we don't know. And I think often the narratives around suicide reflect, politics. So, it can be considered an honorable act, in different cultures. Defeated in war, it could be considered a form of self-sacrifice. But there are also things like widow burning in India, where it is somewhere between volitional and coerced. And it varies case by case. I mean, someone could actually be pushed on the funeral pyre, or a woman could just her life could be made so miserable by her in-laws that she, gives up and goes along with it. And so I think it's hard to say. I think I go with, just where does the evidence go? If we look at suicidal behavior as just one type of phenomenon, I think the evidence strongly suggests that death is a byproduct and not the goal. But there certainly is a possibility that it's just hard to measure that.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about the cultural meanings of suicide here, right? So I think with my question, I kind of already know which direction your answer might lean into, but to what extent do you give weight to these accusations of suicidal behavior as a trend, specifically among adolescents? And I mean, this comes up again and again, right? Thinking about the sorrows of young Werther, this like suicidal wave, or then my question would be, is it a wave of suicidal behavior, or is it also a wave of the genuine wish? So is it more the signal that becomes a trend, or the wish? And the more contemporary examples, such as like the Netflix show 13 Reasons Why, that received a lot of attention for it. And so to what extent do you actually think that this is a genuine danger, that this could become a trend that specifically young adolescents go along with? And if so, is it the signal, or is the genuine death wish that becomes a wish? And also, or do you think it's more just a way out of taking young people's sorrows seriously?
That one. Yeah, but no, I do think the contagion thing is important, and it's very complex because there's so many different types of contagion. I definitely think there's a coalitional aspect to it, just as like a hunger strike. So but it would be people who are experiencing same types of conditions. So adolescents, an adolescent young girl sees other adolescent girls engaging in self-harm. Maybe it's other girls who live in the suburbs, and maybe their parents are divorced or something, and they happen to like the same music, and so they identify with this person. But then there is a learning element to suicidal behavior. I mean, there has to be. There is a learning element to all, behaviors. So I think it can sort of channel behaviors in one direction or another. So it could, shape the type of self-harm that someone engages in, whether that's anorexia or whether that's cutting. But I think there's still so much more to understand. But I think, the signaling coalitional building, I think, and also just the aspect of there's bonding. There's like people like actually bond over like self-harm. Like that's actually what hazing is, for instance, or like, yeah, cult initiations, people bonding over being like experiencing harm together. So yeah, there's definitely something going on there. But in terms of the shows like 13 Reasons Why, I think the data is not really strong there. Yeah.
I looked at Kais because he's like, oh, sorry. I interpret this. So the gender difference in the suicidal behavior and then the suicidal, I don't want to call it a successful suicide, the eventual
death.
suicide.
Yeah.
The death, exactly. The resulting death. That struck me as interesting as well. So young adolescent females show more suicidal behavior, but then young men die of suicide more frequently. Would you say this connects to other phenomena where young men are at the extreme ends of a spectrum, for example, intelligence, and that this is then sometimes connected? So like them having both young men comprising both the higher percentage of people with very high and very low IQs, and that this is somehow connected to just contemporary Western cultures not really just inhibiting young females and not letting them go to any extreme.
Yeah.
This is somehow connected to this like gender gap in the suicidal behavior versus death by suicide as well.
It's an interesting way, yeah. So men, and this is so interesting. So men are more likely to use like more lethal methods like guns and jumping from high places. We also know that men just are more violent, not just to themselves, but also to others. And I think it's just a continuum of the fact that men are just more violent. They're bigger risk takers. And I suspect the risk taking is the reason, and possibly also the types. It could also be that the types of the types of adversities women experience, like they're severe, but men might actually, because of reproductive skew, it's possible that men send higher signals.
Violence, suicide. I wonder how you deal with the classical Durkheim problem of identifying suicide. I mean, I see it now on the slide, but I didn't hear you talk much about euthanasia at all. Yeah, so for example, these data you showed from the CDC, and to an extent, whether people engage in suicidal behaviors is self-reported.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of missing data.
Yeah.
A lot of self-harm, they never make it, also, I know people, people I've worked with in the Pacific who have attempted suicide, never, like a very serious attempt, and were never seen by a doctor. It was never been reported. So, I mean, these very serious attempts are, they go missing, they're completely unknown. And then the issue of even suicide death, where, there's, that has all kinds of issues. It's easier to identify a death. If you're an ethnographer, for instance, as opposed to, an attempt. But yeah, it can be very hard. Yeah, an overdose, for example, is a classic case where it seems, I'm comfortable saying there's some continuous behavior there with like taking and self-destruction, but was it a suicide? Yeah, in those cases, it's really hard to know.
Now, therefore, I was a little struck that you say things like we see it more in this age group than in the older age group.
Oh yeah, so
I think that might just be a labeling issue.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. Certainly young people engage in so they're more likely to, in the US, for instance, they're more likely to end up in the hospital for like self-harm attempts, but it could be, older people might be doing other things that get labeled differently. Yeah. Misusing their medications, and it gets called something else. Yeah.
Yeah, but if
definitely.
if an old person takes takes too much medicine, you would need to have an autopsy actually to identify this. Right? even the Danes would be able to figure it out.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's your turn.
Can you go back to this 2x2 sort of power?
Uh,
Yeah, this, yeah, so I was wondering, I was interested in this high threat, low power quadrants. In particular, what this spirit possession is. And I was wondering, is the contemporary version of spirit possession conspiracy theories?
Interesting. So no, I think spirit possession is like basically people entering a dissociative state. And I think in say like psychiatry is just dissociation. I think actually you go to a rave and some societies they say, oh, everyone's spirit possessed, great, it's yeah, so in a lot of places the spirit possession is specifically like they're kind of depressed, dissociated, withdrawn, and maybe acting like doing some things they're not supposed to be doing, being disruptive in some way, and they're disassociated while they do it.
Also in that fragment, okay, no, just following.
Yeah, can we do a follow-up and then your question? Yeah.
Is it different?
No, you can go.
It's just that I wonder, like conversion, is it only converting into a religion or also like
Oh.
withdrawing from a religion?
Oh, actually, that's an interesting one. So actually conversion is the somatization. It's also another way of like hypochondriasis. But no, the interesting so yeah, it's different from Islamic conversion or religious conversion.
It's the evolutionary advantage of that because I can see like in the signaling like it's like low success, bad way to say it, but low likelihood of death. That signaling if it's a very high likelihood of death as you talk about like the guns or the jumping abilities or maybe like swimming to see how. I was curious like the evolutionary advantage there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the higher, so the costlier the threat, the higher the higher the cost of the signal, the more alarm you signal to others. So that's the way, that's the way it frames that.
So I have actually two questions. And if we have no time, then please answer the second one. So the first one is methodological, because you are someone who has combined wonderfully in your work, working with the EHREF data and also doing your own fieldwork. And I was wondering how much actually convergence you see across using this, written reports of the hunter-gatherer societies and actually studying them.
Yeah.
And the second question, which you can pick to answer, is what are the implications for our treatment of psychiatric disorders that you are actually seeing based on your research?
Yeah. So in terms of, the convergence across accounts, so the Micronesian, I actually started working this group because they have a high suicide rate and they were in the human relations area files. And it was interesting to see how closely they aligned. And so that's always a good feeling when you're getting interviews and you're like, okay, this sounds right. People running away and threatening suicide, I've heard this before, In terms of treatment, it comes down to resolving conflict, because in the West we see it as an individual act, but that's not seen that way everywhere. And I think even in the West, it's a social act, just as it is everywhere else. We're just more individualized, is all. So I think it really means moving treatment away from focusing on the individual to focusing on, social issues. And many therapists do that indirectly now. So they'll work with a suicidal person to increase their sense of self-esteem and power in relationships to help them resolve conflict, but they're not actually helping to resolve conflict most of the time. And then of course the other thing is societal inequality and those types of things. So also, the societal level as well, not making a society a nice place to live in, not making the case that, some men are doing so much better than other men, for instance.
And well, first, let's thank. As Customer Lab, we have a mug for you as a thank you for your interesting talk. Random politics lab in the world. Past over here.
Thank you.
Right, so next week there will not be a politics lab meeting because many people will be away for the ASCAN conference. The week afterwards, on 31st of May, we also won't have a meeting that on June 7th is the next politics lab meeting will take place. And we'll have Mark van Vught, and he'll be talking about ecology, culture, and leadership. Hope to see you all there. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.